The crack of wood meeting leather echoed across the dusty field, drawing the eyes of hundreds of Japanese prisoners upward into the cloudless Montana sky. The white sphere sailed in a perfect arc, suspended for a moment against the blue canvas before gravity reclaimed it, pulling it toward outstretched American hands. Many of the Japanese prisoners had never seen a baseball game before arriving at Camp McCoy, yet now they stood transfixed by this strange ritual unfolding before them. Lieutenant Takeshi Matsukoto, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, squinted against the afternoon sun, his weathered face unreadable as he watched American guards celebrate a home run with easy camaraderie. Their laughter carried across the yard, floating over barbed wire like a melody from another world. How could these men play games while their comrades died across the Pacific? This question burned silently among many prisoners, yet curiosity crept in alongside judgment.
What power did this simple game hold that it could transform grown soldiers into joyful children before their very eyes? The wooden barracks of Camp McCoy had appeared no different from other American prisoner of war camps when the Japanese soldiers first arrived in late 1943. The men had shuffled through the gates with heads bowed, shoulders hunched, prepared for the brutality they had been promised would await them. Imperial officers had drilled the warnings into them relentlessly. Surrender meant torture, humiliation, and likely death. The Emperor's soldiers were expected to fight to the last breath or end their own lives rather than face capture. Those who surrendered had failed their sacred duty and deserved whatever horrors America might inflict. Lieutenant Matsumoto had surrendered at Guadalcanal after shrapnel tore through his leg, leaving him unable to reach for his pistol to complete the final honorable act.
He had lain in the mud, waiting for the American bayonet that would end his shame. Instead, he received morphine, a field dressing, and evacuation to a hospital ship. This incomprehensible mercy had been the first fracture in his understanding of the enemy. Now, watching Americans swing wooden bats in their leisure hours, another crack formed in his certainty. "They waste time on children's games while fighting a war," muttered Sergeant Kido beside him, his tone a mixture of disgust and fascination. "No wonder we will defeat them." But something in Matsumoto's chest tightened at these words. The Americans he observed didn't move like men destined for defeat. Their bodies were strong, well-fed, their movements fluid and confident. Even in play, they exhibited a physical vitality that many Japanese soldiers had lost after years of strict rationing and grueling marches. During the first week at Camp McCoy, the prisoners had maintained rigid discipline, bowing to their superior officers, standing at attention during roll call, keeping strictly to themselves. They prepared mentally for interrogations, torture, starvation, the expected treatment of the dishonored. Yet day after day, the anticipated cruelties never materialized. Instead, they received regular meals, medical treatment, and clean bunks. Guards addressed them without screaming, without the constant threat of physical punishment that characterized Japanese military life. And then there was this: baseball, played almost daily by the guards and camp staff in full view of the prisoners. At first, the Japanese watched covertly, pretending disinterest while stealing glances at the mysterious game. But as weeks passed, more gathered openly at the fence, following the trajectory of the ball, studying the rules, observing the easy way the Americans celebrated or groaned together.
"Watch how they arrange themselves," Matsumoto said quietly to Kido. "It is like a military formation, yet they move with individual freedom." The prisoners had expected brutality, but encountered routine. They had steeled themselves for hunger, but received 3 meals daily. And now, instead of the humiliation they had been promised, they witnessed Americans inviting them, through gestures and broken Japanese, to observe their national pastime. What would happen next, Matsumoto wondered, as a guard approached the fence with an unexpected question that would challenge everything the prisoners believed about their captors. "You men play?" The American guard gestured toward the field, miming a batting swing. His smile revealed teeth unnervingly white and even, a stark contrast to the yellowed, often missing teeth common among Japanese soldiers after years of poor nutrition. Baseball. You want to try? The prisoners exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through their ranks. Was this some elaborate form of humiliation? A trick to identify troublemakers? Silence hung heavy in the air until Private Nori Yamada, barely 20 years old and the youngest among them, stepped forward. "I have seen baseball in Tokyo before war," he said in halting English. "Americans taught Japanese students many years ago." The guard's face brightened. "That's right. You folks have played since the 1870s. One of your university's head teams, right?" Matsumoto was startled by this knowledge. How did this American soldier know details about Japanese educational institutions? The propaganda they had consumed for years painted Americans as uncultured barbarians, ignorant of anything beyond their own borders. The following day, a miracle of sorts occurred on the dusty yard behind the barracks. The fence separating prisoners from the baseball field was temporarily opened under heavy guard, and a dozen Japanese men were allowed onto the diamond. They stood awkwardly at first, surrounded by Americans who demonstrated how to grip the bat, how to throw the peculiar leather-covered ball with its intricate red stitching. The first swing by Sergeant Kido produced nothing but air and nearly sent him sprawling into the dirt. Several guards chuckled, but not unkindly. They adjusted his stance, placed his hands differently on the bat, encouraged him to try again. When the bat finally connected with the ball, sending it rolling weakly toward the pitcher, the Americans cheered as though he had performed some remarkable feat. "They are teaching us," whispered Yamada, disbelief evident in his voice. "Why would they share their knowledge with the enemy?" Lieutenant Matsumoto had no answer. He watched as more prisoners were invited to try, their initial stiffness gradually melting into focused concentration. Some revealed surprising aptitude, particularly those with quick reflexes or good eyesight. Others failed completely, but were met with patience rather than mockery. The sound of laughter, Japanese laughter, startled Matsutomo. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard such a sound. In the training camps of Japan, laughter was discouraged as undisciplined. On the battlefields of the Pacific, it had disappeared altogether. Yet here, behind barbed wire, young men who had prepared themselves for death were finding unexpected joy in hitting a small white ball with a wooden stick. That night in the barracks, the air hummed with excited conversation. Men who had barely spoken for weeks now gestured animatedly, describing their attempts at batting or catching. Some complained of sore muscles, rubbing shoulders unaccustomed to the rotational swing of a baseball bat. Others debated strategy and technique based on their brief exposure. "The Americans swing as though cutting with a sword," observed Corporal Takahashi, who had been a kendo practitioner before the war. "Yet they keep both hands together, not like our traditional strikes. Their pitcher stands exposed, alone in the center," added Private Sato. "But he controls the entire game with deception and precision. There is philosophy in this." Matsumoto listened to these observations with growing fascination. What had begun as mere curiosity was transforming into something deeper, an unexpected bridge across the chasm of war. Was it possible that through this simple game, prisoners and captors might see each other as something more than enemies? As the summer heat intensified across the Montana plain, the baseball sessions became regular, scheduled twice weekly under guard supervision. The Americans donated old gloves, bats that had cracked and been repaired, balls scuffed beyond regulation use. The Japanese prisoners, meticulous by nature and training, treated these cast-offs like treasures, cleaning and maintaining them with the same discipline they had once applied to their rifles. On dusty diamonds marked with chalk and stones, an unlikely transformation began to unfold. Men who had once prepared to die for the emperor now dove for ground balls, swung at pitches, and occasionally, triumphantly, connected with the ball in a satisfying crack that sent it soaring over makeshift outfields. Would this strange American ritual become more than a momentary distraction from the reality of captivity and war? "Hold the glove higher, Tanaka! Don't fear the ball!" Matsumoto called out, surprising himself with his own enthusiasm. Over the weeks, he had assumed an unexpected role, translating American baseball terms into Japanese, explaining strategies, organizing practice sessions during free hours. The Americans had begun providing more equipment, not new, but serviceable. Used mitts with cracked leather that prisoners carefully repaired with thread unraveled from spare clothing. Bats worn smooth from countless swings. Balls so scuffed that their white surfaces had turned a dusty gray. Yet these imperfect tools became the center of camp life for many prisoners. "I never understood this game in school," admitted Private Ichiro Nomura, a former fisherman from Hokkaido. "We played it because our teachers said it built character, but I thought it foolish. Now I see its complexity." He flexed his fingers inside a mended glove, the calluses on his hands no longer from hauling nets, but from endless practice catches. Sergeant Kido, once the most suspicious of American intentions, had discovered remarkable skill as a pitcher. His thin frame, once a disadvantage in combat, gave him a whip-like throwing motion that produced surprising speed. "In the Imperial Army, they called me too weak," he confided to Matsumoto one evening as they practiced throwing techniques. "Here, the Americans say my build is perfect for pitching. They say the great lefty Grove was built like me." The Americans had indeed begun offering more than equipment. They shared knowledge, explaining the subtle arts of the curveball, the strategy of base running, the positioning of fielders. Sergeant Miller, a former minor league player from Pennsylvania, demonstrated pitching grips with the patience of a dedicated sensei. "You got natural talent, Kido," Miller told the Japanese sergeant through an interpreter. "You're throwing sliders without even knowing it." The look of pride that flashed across Kido's face revealed something Matsukato had not seen since their capture. Dignity. Not the rigid, ceremonial dignity of military bearing, but something more human. The satisfaction of discovering capability within oneself. Even as the prisoners developed skills, cultural differences emerged in their approach to the game. Where Americans played with spontaneity and individual flair, the Japanese brought their cultural values of precision, discipline, and group harmony. They practiced relentlessly, breaking down each movement into components to be mastered through repetition. "They treat batting practice like tea ceremony," remarked one American guard to another. "Same swing hundreds of times until it's perfect." Captain Taylor, the camp commander, observed these developments with cautious approval. The baseball program had begun as a simple recreation initiative, but was yielding unexpected benefits. Discipline problems had decreased. Communication between guards and prisoners had improved. The atmosphere within the camp had shifted subtly from tense standoff to something approaching mutual respect. "I played against Waseda University before the war," an elderly American chaplain told Matsumoto during one practice session, "toured Japan in 1934. "Your countrymen were already formidable players then." This casual revelation stunned Matsumoto. Americans visited Japan to play baseball against Japanese teams? The chaplain nodded. "Oh yes, baseball has connected our countries for decades. Babe Ruth toured Japan in 1934. Huge crowds. Met your Emperor Hirohito, I believe." This information cascaded through the prisoner barracks that evening, challenging yet another pillar of their pre-war understanding. The Emperor himself had received American baseball players as honored guests? Why had such connections been erased from their awareness once war began? As autumn approached and the Montana air sharpened with the promise of winter, the unlikely baseball program faced a critical moment. Captain Taylor announced a bold proposal: a formal game between a prisoner team and a guard team, to be played on a Saturday afternoon with the entire camp as audience. How would this contest between captors and captured on a field where, for a few hours at least, they would meet as equals, bound only by the rules of a shared game? The day of the game dawned clear and cool, the October sky a bottomless blue above the Montana plains. For the Japanese prisoners, the morning brought an unexpected delivery: complete baseball uniforms donated by a minor league team from Helena. The uniforms were worn, with faded lettering and patches from previous seasons, but to men who had spent months in prison garb, they represented something profound: recognition of their humanity. Lieutenant Matsumoto stood before his assembled team in the barracks, feeling strangely emotional as they donned the unfamiliar uniforms. These men, pilots, infantrymen, naval officers, had come from different regions of Japan, different branches of service, different social backgrounds.
Yet baseball had forged them into a unit more cohesive than any military drill could accomplish. Today, we play not for victory, Matsumoto told them, choosing his words carefully. We play to honor the spirit of the game that has given us purpose during our captivity. But in their eyes, he saw something more, the unmistakable glint of competitive fire. These were warriors after all, even without weapons or imperial orders. Private Yamada adjusted his cap nervously. The Americans have played longer. They invented the game. How can we hope to match them? Sergeant Kino spun a baseball in his fingers, his expression contemplative. They have played longer, yes, but we have practiced with Japanese discipline. Remember, we did not know how to fight wars before Perry came to our shores. Within decades, we defeated the Russians. We learn quickly. Captain Taylor had arranged for bleachers to be erected around the camp's main field. As the Japanese team emerged from their barracks, they were startled to see not only the camp's prisoners and guards assembled, but visitors from nearby towns, civilians in their weekend clothes, children with gloves and balls of their own, hoping for autographs from both teams. "My God," whispered Corporal Takahashi, "they treat this like a festival." The American team jogged onto the field, their uniforms a mix of military PT gear and civilian baseball attire. They called greetings to the Japanese players, familiar names now after months of shared practice. The strangeness of the situation, enemies preparing to play a friendly game while their countrymen killed each other across the Pacific, hung in the air like an unacknowledged ghost. As the game began, tension translated into intense concentration. Kido took the mound for the Japanese team, his slender form gathering surprising power as he delivered his first pitch, a fastball that caught the corner of the plate for a called strike. The American batter, a burly MP named Rodriguez, tipped his cap in respect. The gesture, small but significant, set the tone for what followed. This would be competitive but honorable. By the third inning, with the score tied at 2 runs apiece, something remarkable had happened. The barriers between opponents, cultural, linguistic, military, seemed to dissolve in the rhythm of the game. When Yamada hit a double that bounced to the outfield wall, American spectators applauded alongside Japanese prisoners. When Sergeant Miller struck out 3 Japanese batters in succession with a devastating curveball, the Japanese players nodded in appreciation of his skill. "Watch how they communicate without words," Matsumoto observed to Captain Taylor as they stood near the dugout. A nod, a hand signal, a shift in position. The game creates its own language. Taylor, a thoughtful man who had studied at Princeton before the war, considered this. Perhaps that's why baseball has endured. It's both individual and collective. Each player has his moment alone, at bat, on the mound, but within a structure that requires perfect coordination. "Like Japanese society," Matsumoto replied, "the individual exists to serve the group. And yet," Taylor noted, "in America, we emphasize how the group exists to showcase individual talent." He gestured toward Rodriguez, who was attempting to steal second base with a dramatic slide. "We celebrate the risk-taker, the standout." This philosophical exchange was interrupted by cheers, as Rodriguez was called safe by inches. The game continued. Inning after inning, the lead changing hands multiple times. As the afternoon sun began to lengthen shadows across the field, the score stood at 6-5, with the Americans holding the narrow lead in the final inning. With 2 outs and a runner on second base, Lieutenant Matsumoto stepped to the plate. The symbolism of the moment was lost on no one. The senior Japanese officer facing Miller, the Americans' best pitcher, with the game hanging in the balance. Miller nodded respect to his opponent, then delivered a fastball that seemed to disappear before reaching the plate. Matsumoto swung and missed, almost falling with the effort. Strike 1. The second pitch curved wickedly, and Matsumoto held his swing by millimeters. "Ball," called the umpire, an impartial sergeant from the medical corps. Miller's third pitch came straight and true. Matsumoto's bat connected with a sound like a small thunderclap. The ball soared high into the autumn sky, carrying toward the outfield fence. Americans and Japanese alike rose to their feet, all eyes following the white sphere's arc against the fading blue. The American center fielder tracked backward, reaching up at the last possible moment. The ball disappeared into his glove, then reappeared as it slipped through his fingers and fell beyond the fence. A home run! Game tied! The Japanese prisoners erupted in cheers, their usual reserve shattered by the moment. Matsumoto circled the bases with measured steps, his face composed despite the earthquake of emotion within. As he touched home plate, Miller was waiting. The American extended his hand. Matsumoto, after a moment's hesitation, took it. The game ended in a tie, 7-7, as darkness made further play impossible. But something more significant than victory had been achieved. On a dusty field in Montana, former enemies had found common ground in the geometry of a diamond and the shared language of sport.
What would this mean for these men once the war ended and they returned to their respective homelands? Winter transformed Camp McCoy, burying baseball fields under Montana snow. The diamonds where Japanese and Americans had found unexpected connection lay dormant, waiting for spring. But inside the heated barracks, the spirit of the game continued to burn. The prisoners fashioned miniature bats from scrap wood, wrapped balls of yarn and cloth to practice handling. Japanese officers who had once devoted themselves to military manuals now studied baseball rulebooks provided by the camp library. In Japan, we taught baseball but never embraced its heart, Sergeant Kido told a group of younger prisoners as they practiced swings in the narrow space between bunks. We made it rigid, like military drill.
Now I understand its beauty lies in balance, discipline with creativity, tradition with adaptation. Lieutenant Matsumoto had become the unofficial historian of baseball among the prisoners. Through conversations with guards and readings from American sporting magazines, he pieced together the complex relationship between Japan and this most American of games. American professors brought baseball to Japanese universities in the 1870s, he explained during evening discussions. By 1915, our high schools had adopted it widely. But we always saw it as foreign, something to master but not love. Perhaps that was our mistake. As 1944 turned to 1945, news of the war's progress reached the camp in carefully censored newspaper reports and radio broadcasts.
The Japanese prisoners listened with stoic faces to accounts of Allied advances across the Pacific, of firebombing raids on Tokyo, of islands once held by imperial forces now captured. Their homeland was suffering defeats unknown for generations, yet here they sat, studying the intricacies of the sacrifice bunt and the double play. "Is it not dishonorable?" asked a recently captured officer who had arrived at Camp McCoy in February, "to play games while our countrymen die?" Matsumoto considered the question seriously. "I once thought as you do. But I have come to see baseball as more than a game. It is a philosophy, a language, perhaps even a tool for understanding our enemy and ourselves." The new officer scoffed. "Next, you will say it is a path to peace." "Perhaps it is," Matsumoto replied quietly.
What else brings former enemies together in shared respect? As spring returned to Montana and the baseball diamond emerged from melting snow, news reached the camp that shattered the tenuous harmony. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. The American guards moved through their duties with subdued demeanor, flags lowered to half-mast. The Japanese prisoners, conditioned to believe in leadership worship, expected displays of mass hysteria or despair. Instead, they witnessed something remarkable: continuity amid grief. The camp routine continued. The Constitution functioned as designed. A new president took office without coup or crisis. "Even their succession is like baseball," observed Corporal Takahashi. "One player leaves the field, another takes his position, and the game continues uninterrupted." When summer arrived and baseball resumed in earnest, subtle changes appeared in how the Japanese prisoners approached the game. They began to incorporate American spontaneity alongside their disciplined practice, celebrating good plays with high fives and vocal encouragement. Young Private Yamada developed a home run ritual, tipping his cap to all four corners of the field after crossing home plate.
The Americans, meanwhile, adopted elements of Japanese precision in their training, implementing structured practice routines and paying greater attention to fundamentals. The cross-pollination occurred organically, without directive or plan. "We're creating a new style," Captain Taylor remarked to Matsumoto during a particularly competitive game in July. "Not purely American, not purely Japanese." Before Matsumoto could respond, a guard approached with urgent news. All baseball activities were suspended. The prisoners were confined to barracks until further notice. Something momentous had occurred, though no explanation was provided. That evening, the mystery was revealed through the camp's public address system. America had deployed a weapon of unprecedented destructive power against the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Details were sparse, but the implications clear. The war was entering its final, devastating phase. In the shocked silence that followed this announcement, Matsumoto looked around at the men with whom he had shared the baseball diamond, Americans and Japanese alike. The game that had bridged their differences suddenly seemed trivial against the backdrop of such destruction. Yet somehow it also felt more important than ever. August brought surrender, Emperor Hirohito's voice reaching even Camp McCoy's remote location, announcing Japan's capitulation. The Japanese prisoners received this news with varying reactions. Some wept openly. Others maintained rigid stoicism. A few even attempted ritual suicide. The baseball equipment lay untouched for weeks, as though both captors and captured silently agreed that games had no place amid history's solemn turning. But as autumn returned to Montana and repatriation plans formed for the Japanese prisoners, an unexpected request came from Captain Taylor. One final game. A farewell match between the guards and prisoners who had, despite everything, formed bonds of respect through their shared passion. The October day echoed the previous year's game. Clear skies, cool air, the sense of ceremony. But everything else had changed. Japan lay in ruins, occupied by American forces. The war that had seemed endless was now history. The men who took the field did so not as ongoing enemies, but as representatives of nations that would now need to forge a different relationship. "Today, we play for the future," Matsumoto told his team in the dugout, their faces solemn yet determined. "What we have learned here, about baseball, about America, about ourselves, we will carry home." Sergeant Kido, who would soon return to a Hiroshima he could scarcely imagine after the atomic devastation, nodded gravely. "We will teach true baseball to Japan, not as a foreign curiosity, but as a bridge between our peoples." The game itself was less competition than celebration. Spectacular plays met with applause from both sides. Missed opportunities greeted with encouraging words rather than disappointment. When the final out was recorded, the score seemed almost irrelevant. As the teams lined up to shake hands, Captain Taylor presented Matsumoto with a gift. A professional quality glove, well worn but carefully maintained. "This was my father's," Taylor said simply. "Take it back to Japan. Remember what we shared here." Matsumoto accepted the glove with a formal bow, struggling to maintain his composure. "We came as enemies," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "We leave as, what? Not exactly friends, but something more than enemies." "Baseball men," Taylor suggested with a small smile. "That's something that transcends borders." In the spring of 1946, the former prisoners of Camp McCoy returned to a Japan transformed by defeat and occupation. They brought with them countless stories of American abundance, of unexpected treatment, of survival and adaptation. But among the most influential were the stories of baseball, carried by men who had learned the game's deepest aspects from those who had invented it. Lieutenant Matsumoto, returning to the ruins of Tokyo, discovered a nation desperate for new beginnings. The militarism that had defined his youth lay discredited. Old certainties had crumbled like the bombed-out buildings that lined what were once proud avenues. In this vacuum, baseball, with its clear rules, its balance of individual and collective, its opportunities for honor without warfare, offered something precious, a path forward that neither rejected Japanese values nor clung to failed imperial dreams. Within 5 years, professional baseball leagues were established throughout Japan, built partly on pre-war foundations but infused with the authentic understanding brought home by former prisoners. Sergeant Kido became a pitching coach for the Yomiuri Giants. Private Yamada played professionally until an injury led him to broadcasting. Corporal Takahashi established youth leagues that taught baseball alongside traditional values of discipline and respect. And Lieutenant Matsumoto? He never played professionally, but his influence ran deeper. Using Captain Taylor's gift, that well-worn American glove, he taught neighborhood children the game on makeshift diamonds scratched into the recovering city. Later, he wrote one of Japan's first comprehensive books on baseball strategy, incorporating both American creativity and Japanese discipline.
When American occupation authorities sought cultural exchanges to rebuild relationships between former enemies, baseball provided natural common ground. Exhibition games between American and Japanese teams drew crowds that dwarfed political gatherings. The diamond became a space where defeat could transform into respectful competition, where a nation's pride could rebuild without militarism's dark shadow. By 1964, when Tokyo hosted the Olympics, baseball had become Japan's unofficial national sport, played in schoolyards and professional stadiums with equal passion. The prisoners of Camp McCoy, now middle-aged men scattered across a rebuilding nation, watched this evolution with quiet satisfaction. What had begun behind barbed wire in Montana had blossomed into a cultural bridge spanning the Pacific.
Perhaps somewhere, on a summer evening, when the crack of bat meeting ball echoes across fields in both Hiroshima and Hoboken, the spirit of those unlikely games at Camp McCoy lives on. A reminder that even in our darkest chapters, humans find ways to recognize each other's humanity. Baseball, born in America but embraced by Japan, stands as testament to how the simplest games can carry the most profound lessons about who we are and who we might become. Is there not something worth remembering in how a prisoner's first uncertain swing of a bat ultimately helped rebuild a bridge between nations that war had nearly destroyed forever?